All right, so I wanted to just give you guys to develop a video to try to explain the concept, what I see as the primary concept for this week, which is Aristotle's virtue ethics, or Aristotelian virtue ethics, or virtue. And I would recommend starting with the elements of moral philosophy as the kind of guide for this week, and really spend some time reading and trying to digest virtue ethics, because I think that this kind of core concept applies in the other two readings to the case study. To give you kind of my like thoughts and overview, the way I would begin with Aristotle is to contrast him with the traditional idea of ethics. And about a number of years ago, a Secretary of Education wrote a popular book called the Book of Ethics, or the Book of Virtue. It was the Book of Virtues. And it was Bill Bennett who wrote the book. And I think the idea is the book was based on a really core idea in our society, which is that there are like kind of core objective virtues that exist, and that being a virtuous person is the habit, or I guess maybe the practice of acting with virtue, by taking the more virtuous route. So for example, being courageous, kind, caring for others in need, being generous, thoughtful. I mean, I think you could kind of draft out, and that's basically what Bennett did. He just kind of came up with a list of the core virtues and basically argued that what we need to instill in kids is the practice of acting on these ideas. And I'll give you sort of an off the wall kind of example to try to illustrate how Aristotle differs. And a number of years ago, there was this movie came out called The Other Guys. It was Will Ferrell and Mark Wahlberg. And in the movie, Samuel Jackson and The Rock play these like hero cops, these super cops, and that always kind of do the right thing or know what to do. And in an early part of the film, The Rock and Samuel Jackson are chasing these bad guys, bank robbers or something, and they chase them to the top of a building. The bad guys escape on a zip line and cut the zip line. And The Rock and Samuel Jackson look at each other. They both kind of are like, "Are you thinking what I'm thinking?" And then they jump off the building. And then the scene cuts, and the next scene is their funeral. And it's kind of a funny way to sort of illustrate that, like, there's a difference between, I guess, being courageous and doing something reckless or dumb. And this is kind of what Aristotle really wants to say, is that, you know, in practice and in reality, doing what's right and making the ethical decision is often a mediation between complicated, different like things, like being reckless versus being courageous, being honest or being cruel, you know. You know, saying things, kind of blurting out things that are, you know, with that almost kind of like childlike honesty that can hurt people's feelings, or being generous versus being, you know, I guess poorly managing your finances or something. You know, that each actual virtue is a mediation between these extremes, and in practice it gets very complicated and is difficult. And you know, I think it's really, again, kind of hard to illustrate this perfectly, but you know, I think another point about virtue ethics is a lot of times when somebody does something. There was a story a few weeks ago that you might have seen in the news, where a man jumped a fence and saved basically like an infant or really young child who had walked into a pool and fell. And while I mean, I think this guy's a hero, he was paying attention, he made the right decision, acted decisively. Like, most of us wouldn't think that it was a very complicated ethical decision, that he had to really debate whether or not it was right or wrong to save a child in that situation. So it wasn't necessarily the courage of the act. You know, he didn't put himself into harm's way, and nobody really, I think, would have thought that it was a very difficult ethical decision. It was just a heroic act because he was alert and decisive and made the decision. In reality, I think things are much more complicated. And I'll just give you, from my personal experience, one where that comes to mind for virtue ethics is, you know, with people like panhandling or asking for money, or people who might be homeless or in need. And I had two friends kind of growing up that I distinctly remember who had strong views on opposite ends of the spectrum. One that was really angry at people or adversarial or hostile toward people asking for money. And then I had another friend who I remember used to say, he would give people money and he would say, that guy needs a drink more than I do. And I thought there was a real problem with both ends of that spectrum. And I spent some time thinking about it, tried to really mediate my own perspective and come up with a decision that I felt okay with. And then I'll just tell you, like, what happened then too in my 20s was I went to you know, Mexico and Central America. And I remember that was where I first encountered children basically on the street asking for money. And that was one where I think I still struggle with today. You know, I've read strong, convincing cases that you know, that it just encourages parents to send kids out when people give them money, when they should be in school and things like that. The other perspective is that, you know, these kids really don't have another option. It's best to support them. But I think that's an example, again, where to know what to do in that situation really requires a kind of reflection on the situation, kind of weighing the different elements of it, and coming to a decision that you feel comfortable with, kind of based, again, on what you know, as much as you could possibly know about the situation. So Aristotle, again, is thinking that people need to kind of practice, in a sense, but also become habitual, in terms of the virtuous person is someone who makes a habit of trying to do the best thing, the most ethical thing possible in those situations, knowing that, you know, it's difficult to find that mediation between different kind of competing potential decisions. To give you an example, last night I saw in the news there was a girl who drove off a pier into a body of water, and her car began to sink, and this 17-year-old kid, there were a number of people around, oddly, and a number of them just, as you might imagine in today's world, just pulled out their phone and started filming it. And this 17-year-old kid made a decisive decision to jump in, and as it turned out, this girl was in shock. She was unable to get out of the car, and this guy was able to get the car door open and pull her to safety. And I think, again, that's a much more difficult, courageous act, because he put himself into some danger. You know, he made a decision and then acted upon it. And that would be the kind of practice that I think Aristotle's talking about. So in the Elements of Moral Philosophy, the book talks about, you know, making virtue a kind of habit. And it's not just a habit of doing the right thing, it's a habit of trying to figure out the right thing and struggling with that contemplation to do the right thing when it's a little unclear exactly of what decision to make. And so that, for Aristotle, is virtue ethics. It's one that I feel there's you know, tremendous value in that is probably the most kind of thoughtful in its approach to ethics. Um, the book makes the argument that it's maybe not complete. It doesn't give us all of, there are certain other maybe things that we can work on in ourselves that aren't that complicated balance between the extremes. So one they give in the book is being dependable. That's kind of a practice we might develop. Um, so it's maybe not complete, but I do think that it is at least one to really consider. And getting into the other books with the case studies, with ethical leadership, um, and the ethics of school administration. One other concept from the book is consequentialism, from the ethics of school administration, that's explored in relation to John Stuart Mill. And virtue ethics would be different than consequentialism. Utilitarianism is a consequentialist argument. It's based on the consequence. The ethical decision is right if the consequences of it justify it. Virtue ethics is saying that we often have to act in situations in which we don't fully understand, or at least are not entirely able to anticipate the implications of our actions. I don't always know what the impact is of giving money to kids who are panhandling on the streets in certain countries. The guy who jumped in to save the young woman in the car that had submerged really had no entire way of knowing what the consequences of that action were going to be. He did the right thing in spite of those things, and so virtue ethics is not a consequentialist argument. It's about the person you are. It's about developing those attributes in yourself and becoming a virtuous person, again, kind of based on your habit of trying to make the right decision in the right situation. And then for the other book, the ethical leadership, that book talks about authenticity and presence. And I think that the argument there, at least in terms of authenticity, with Charles, connecting back to Charles Taylor, is that authentic leaders are trying to be, I guess, again, true to themselves and what they feel is the best thing. It's Taylor, I think, in a similar way with John Stuart Mill, is trying to mediate between that individualism and the collective good. If we're authentic to ourselves, we realize that we do have a commitment to the larger social group. We do have a responsibility to others, to other human beings. And so that authenticity is connected to that. An authentic leader or educator is somebody who's concerned with others and doing the right things in those situations. And then he talks about presence. And I think that his idea in chapter 4 of presence, being present in the moment, is again trying to try to engage moments of ethical decision making by really weighing what the right decision is on the circumstances and situations in which you find yourself, as opposed to maybe trying to revert back to a core kind of dogma or ideological kind of position. It would be trying to be present to the moment in the situation. Now, that gets complicated because I do think, like, with Aristotle and that idea of Aristotelian virtue ethics, um, you are trying to know as much possible as you can about a situation. You're trying to evaluate things with as much evidence and information that you could possibly get. You're trying to eliminate uncertainty. You're not just trying to, and you are trying to develop habits. So again, going back to the example with panhandling, I mean, that I gave, it is trying to kind of come to, a decision about the best way to approach that situation. But I think that it's kind of recognizing the need to evaluate the situation and the context in which you find yourself, and to make that decision, again, maybe based between the two different competing factors. I tried to give you a couple of those, but between being honest and being cruel, between being reckless and being courageous, between being to helping others versus maybe enabling others, or though this is another example that I've often used for this, is that I think like helping others in need is a good principle, and it's a good idea, but most of us, I'm sure, if we thought a little bit about it, could come up with counterexamples. Like, you wouldn't maybe pick up somebody who's hitchhiking, in certain situations, if you're alone or vulnerable. But I think more than that, more getting into virtue ethics, it's like, I think for a parent, often a really difficult thing is like knowing, when should I help my kid? When should I tie their shoes? When should I say, no, you need to kind of work through this. You need to figure this out. And I think that it's not always a clear answer. It's just a matter of, again, I mean, going back to the one reading, being present in the moment, kind of using your contemplation and what you thought about, maybe what you know about child development, different factors like that, educating yourself as much as possible, and then coming to a decision based on that. That would be, or again, too, another example would be in relationships. I think knowing when to step in, when to help somebody else, when to kind of have boundaries, and know when to, sort of to set limits and things like that. So, all right, well, I hope this is helpful and helps you to understand virtue ethics a little bit clearer. And what I would recommend is to start with the principles of moral philosophy, understand virtue ethics, and then look at the other concepts introduced in the readings: consequentialism, authenticity, and responsibility in relation to virtue ethics. So hope this is helpful.